Does insulin resistance keep you from losing weight? I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome to my channel where I review and debunk nutritional misinformation online. Thanks for sending the videos. This is one by Dr. Mark Morris. He's a nutrition doctor, and he is going to be, I would say, so he's a coach of nutrition and weight loss online, and he coaches coaches on how to be coaches. So he's a teacher in a certain way of coaches. So insulin resistance, we're going to get into this, and at the end you'll hear what I think he got right and what I think he got wrong.
Today I'm setting the record straight on the true relationship between insulin resistance and weight loss. Here we go. Now before we get too far, let's talk about what insulin resistance is and how it could impact your ability to lose weight. So when we eat food, an organ in our body called the pancreas secretes insulin with the main job of taking sugar out of the bloodstream and delivering it to cells where it can be used for energy. Now when someone is more resistant to insulin, basically what this means is that the body's cells don't respond as well to insulin, and they generally go higher and stay higher than compared to a normal person. And as a result, the glucose uptake in those cells is impaired. The liver, which is going to be another organ in your body that stores glucose, may release more. And as I mentioned before, you're going to produce more insulin. Now, insulin resistance can happen for quite a few different reasons. There's a family history as well as medications, but also lack of exercise and excess body weight. Speaking of body weight, insulin resistance usually increases with more weight gain and is a sign that a person may develop type 2 diabetes down the line, but not always.
Okay, well, so did that make sense? A lot of people talk about insulin resistance like it's a phenomenon that occurs out of the blue in the cell. You heard the environment, the genetics, the extra weight and all that. Well, the other part of the story so far is a lot of glucose gets into the cells without insulin. You know, the way people talk about glucose and insulin in a simplified, oversimplified way, it would seem like if you didn't have insulin, no glucose would get into any cells, and that's not true. There are a lot of cells that allow glucose in without insulin. These are called GLUT receptors, GLUT receptors, and one of the receptors is insulin mediating or insulin responsive, so it won't let the glucose in without insulin with that receptor. So actually a lot of glucose can get into the red blood cells, into the brain, into a lot of tissues, and it doesn't require insulin. So the question is, why does, in the cells that require insulin, why doesn't the insulin work as well? That's what insulin resistance is. And you know, the history of it is very fascinating. In a recent book by Gary Taubes called Rethinking Diabetes, it came out in January 2024, he tells the history that type 1s and type 2s diabetics were treated in the same way, by giving insulin, because there was no measurement of insulin in the blood, so that insulin lowered the blood glucose for type 1s and type 2s. It wasn't until the 1970s when the insulin in the blood could be measured, the technique hadn't been developed yet, that it was found that people with type 2 diabetes already had elevated levels of insulin. So that it really, in the hormonal endocrinology world, if the hormone's high, you try to lower it. If it's low, you try to raise it. Even Gary, in the book, Gary Taubes argues that this is not the typical method of endocrinology. If insulin is already high in type 2 diabetes, you don't want to give more insulin. You want to lower the insulin level. And this is spot on. In fact, that's a dictum, a precept of obesity medicine, is that if your insulin is high, you have insulin resistance and the insulin's high, you want to lower the insulin, not give more insulin like a lot of endocrinologists do with type 2 diabetes. It's lowering the blood sugar for the moment, but it's not fixing the root problem, which is insulin resistance. So a better metaphor I find for insulin resistance is the idea that your ears turn down the amount to hear in a louder room. So the more noise you have around, in fact, if you go to a concert and it's really, really loud, your ears turn down the ability to hear the noise, the sound. That's what happens when you have insulin around a lot in the blood. The cells start lowering their ability to hear. And it takes time for that to heal. And here is one area where I don't think Dr. Morris gets it right, is when he says that carbohydrates have nothing to do with this. Carbohydrates and protein, to a little bit extent, you'll hear about that, do raise the insulin level, and insulin level around all the time, trying to push glucose into the cells turn down its ability to bring in the glucose because it doesn't need any more. Your ears turn down the ability to hear because it's already too loud. And so this is the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis description and explanation of what insulin resistance is. It's carbs and insulin. Insulin's up and the cells don't want the glucose anymore, so they turn down. And the alternative explanation is that there's some hidden force in the cell because you're heavy and overweight, and carbs are less important. But let's go on in this video, and what we're going to hear is a hopeless and common confusion of calories and carbs. And at the end, I'm going to show you and tell you something that will just kind of blow your mind.
So you may be thinking, is this what's stopping me or my nutrition clients from losing weight? And if so, what is the best way to become more sensitive to insulin, which is going to be the opposite of resistant, so that you can burn fat and lose weight and keep it off for good? Now, here's where the confusion starts, because even if you are resistant to insulin, it doesn't mean that you can't lose weight. In fact, you really shouldn't be worried about where your insulin levels are at any given time, because that metric is not the primary driver of the results you're looking for. And that's because weight loss comes down to energy balance. It's much less dependent on how much carbs you eat and even less on what your insulin levels are like, which may be hard to believe, but this is what the science shows, and there's even more practical examples of this.
No, so I agree with that it's always been about calories. And it's fascinating to see people stand up and say, no, calories don't matter. If you're in a clinical practice, you're going to see that, calories don't count exactly like you can calculate what's the calorie is outside the body in its internal use of the calorie, because the hormonal change in response to what type of calorie it is very different. This is the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis of obesity. But it's always been about calories. In the first study I did, I knew that people were eating fewer calories on a low carb diet. I used what was called the Atkins induction method, and it's a low carb keto diet that I still use today, and people ate less automatically. They started eating less, the hunger goes down, they eat less, it becomes a low calorie diet. So now we're getting into this. Dr. Morris is expecting someone to say that calories don't matter, and no, it's right. It's always been about calories. It's just not very helpful. So how many of you have been on a low calorie diet and you've been fraught with hunger? Because it's the carbs, if you're sensitive to them and you don't eliminate them or get them way down, those make you hungry. A recent example in my office, someone came in doing a lower carb diet, then a lower and lower, and it wasn't until it was around the keto level of carbohydrates that the hunger went away. And so if I was teaching this person to restrict calories at a higher carb level, there would be this fight with hunger. And hunger is the death knell of any weight loss program. So I have to think that perhaps Dr. Morris works with people who are not the sickest of the sick. My average BMI in my clinic is anywhere between 33 and 35 kilograms per meter squared. It's an obesity medicine clinic. And hunger is a big problem when people are eating carbohydrates. If you're working with people who are relatively healthy and otherwise not on a lot of medicines, don't have diabetes, you may be able to do a higher carb, low calorie diet, and it will work. If you go back to our studies that we did comparing low fat diets to low carb diets, this is going back to the year 2004, we were always very careful to say that the low fat diet worked for some people. But the low carb diet worked better on average. And so, yes, there are a lot of ways to do it. Calories do matter, but at the end of the video, I'm going to tell you a story that, again, will kind of shock you.
Think of any athlete that's eating a lot of carbohydrates. They would not look like that if insulin was the problem. But you may need a little more convincing, so let's dive into a little bit more about blood sugar. We know that insulin is responsible for regulating our blood sugar levels. And this is because the ideal blood sugar level, or what's considered normal, is going to be between 4 to 7 millimoles per liter, or 80 to 130 milligrams per deciliter. What is considered normal blood sugar is going to be similar across the world, but there's different units of measurement. Now, for healthy individuals, you don't need to track how much sugar is in your bloodstream because your body regulates that for you, unless of course you have type 1 or type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, so that's a little oversimplified. If you're only looking at your blood glucose or blood sugar, you may be keeping a blood sugar at a quote normal level at the expense or because your insulin level goes very high. So you may have insulin resistance and you may not be healthy even though the blood glucose is normal. And so that's where the insulin resistance is really a function of the blood glucose and the blood insulin levels, both there together. And remember, the glucose can get into cells without insulin. In fact, in other species that don't eat carbs, like cold water fish, for example, is probably true in carnivores too. I just haven't seen these data. If you don't eat carbs, even as a human, insulin really isn't there to regulate the blood glucose. There's a different hormone called glucagon. Glucagon raises and keeps the blood sugar at a constant level when you don't eat dietary carbohydrate. And some have argued that insulin really wasn't designed, the teleologic sort of way, wasn't designed to lower the blood glucose because it's not a very good way to do it, because insulin only helps glucose into some of the cells, the muscle cells mainly. So the idea that you have to have insulin to keep the blood glucose down is just not true if you're not eating carbohydrate. Glucagon will normalize the blood glucose even without insulin. Well, a little bit is required, but you don't have to have a lot of it. So it's interesting. A lot of what Dr. Morris is talking about comes from the carbohydrate-centric teaching. So that's what I received. It was normal, quote, normal to have a blood sugar rise after a meal because everyone ate carbohydrates. It was normal. Well, it's not necessarily optimal. So if you eat a low carb diet and the blood glucose doesn't go up after the meal, the insulin doesn't go up after the meal, that's a very different situation. And the hormonal differences are big. And insulin resistance gets better when you cut carbohydrates out of the diet and when you lose the weight. And that's where it's the 1-2 punch of a low carb diet is you get the blood glucose reduction and insulin reduction, and you get the weight loss, which is the ultimate fixing of the insulin resistance, the prediabetes, diabetes.
But generally, these blood sugar levels spike after eating a meal and come back down to normal baseline levels regardless of how much carbohydrate you're eating. These levels come down, especially in healthy people.
Well, again, that's if you eat carbohydrates, the blood glucose goes up. More and more people are not eating carbohydrates and not getting that after meal rise in glucose and insulin.
Now, one thing to keep in mind though is large fluctuations of blood sugar throughout the day can result in having energy spikes and crashes, but this generally can be fixed by eating a mixed high quality diet that'll keep your energy levels more balanced. And what this looks like for most people is choosing more higher quality sources of carbohydrates like whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, typically things that contain fiber and take longer to digest, so the glucose is released into the bloodstream slower, which is going to be the opposite of more simple carbohydrate sources like refined grains and processed sugar that are absorbed in the bloodstream very quickly, leading to big spikes in blood sugar levels. And that's where insulin comes in to bring your blood sugar levels back to normal. And this always happens during the period of time right after you eat. With all that said, it doesn't mean that eating carbohydrates and having a blood sugar spike is what's stopping you from losing weight. And later on in this video, I'll tell you why insulin may not be the cause either.
Well, and so that is a matter of degree. And there's a lot of teaching and kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and Yes, eating carbohydrates does raise the insulin level, and yes, lowering carbohydrates lowers the insulin level. Now, you can do a calorie restricted diet, the energy in, energy out, with a lower carb or even higher carb type of diet and get the same response. At Duke here in Durham, North Carolina, years ago, there was a program called the Rice Diet. You may have heard of that. Some people mistakenly believe it still exists. It closed its doors some time ago. Well, it was rice, fruit, and fish. But the twist on it, as it was used as a weight loss program, is that it was very low in carbohydrates. And in the inpatient program, people would come and stay in Durham, little old Durham, for months at a time. They weren't fed much rice, fruit, and fish. So it was a very low calorie, one of these ultra low fat sorts of programs. It's low in calorie, and as energy in, energy out dictum says, you have less energy going in, you're going to be drawing upon your fat cells and lose your fat weight. And it worked really well. Of course, for those who found religion and then kept it going at home, they did really great. For those who thought it was hard to do and hard to maintain, they didn't do so well when they went home. And that's true with any type of program that's very different than what you're doing at home. If you go to a place, do something different, and you have to be able to transition back home to keep it going. So the idea that the insulin isn't a player here is just not correct. But the way you lower the insulin could be low carb, or it could be low calorie with higher carb. They're both going to give you the same result.
Now, when it comes to carbohydrates and insulin, carbohydrates are a great source of energy for your body because it's super easy for our bodies to get the energy.
So that was a bit disturbing to me. I wish I had the technology to do a video like this and show the heart beating and say at the same time, the heart mostly uses fatty acids. Yeah, not carbohydrates. So what happened in that clip is the heart is beating here, and my thinking was that the heart is using sugar. No, the heart uses mainly fat. Even under normal circumstances, or when the heart is in heart failure, it's using fatty acids and ketones. Like a diesel pump that's going on and on, it needs a fuel source that is reliable and sustainable, and fat provides that. So again, we're getting the carbohydrate-centric view of metabolism and physiology, which isn't the only way that to view this. And I have to believe that carbs kind of were the center of metabolism and understanding, even in the field of endocrinology, because by the time we could measure all of these things, people were already eating lots of carbohydrates. So there's a understanding that if you're the first one to study something, it's usually the most important thing. So we have a very carbohydrate-centric view of medicine, of nutrition, and even of metabolism in this video.
Either we're taking it from our glycogen stores in our muscle or our liver, or from your bloodstream, which is going to be very important for active individuals or people that play a lot of sports, because your body's going to require enough of this energy to perform well. Both simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates are going to give your body a quick source of energy, although in most cases complex carbohydrates, since they contain fiber, are going to be a more healthy addition to your overall diet. Now, trendy low carbohydrate diets that tell you to remove all of these carbohydrates can help you lose weight, but it's not because of the absence of carbohydrates. Let me explain. Weight gain occurs when you eat too many calories. You're consuming too much overall food, which can be from refined carbohydrates and sugar, but that's generally because they're easier to overconsume. Think foods like soda and chips, cookies and cake, which will also contain fat as well. I'm not playing favorites here. But since these foods are highly processed, it makes them very palatable and easy to overconsume, especially in one sitting. And they also offer very little nutritional value, so outside of the calories, they don't offer you much health promoting benefits. With that being said, they don't cause weight gain because they have carbohydrates in them, it's because they add more calories to your diet.
Well, so that, how do we, I'm trying to figure out how to teach a very smart individual like this, that actually when you have no carbohydrates, your body starts drawing upon its own fat. And so it actually is the absence of carbohydrates that allows the body to draw upon its own fat. And there's less calories going in at the same time. And it's interesting because a lot of people can't hold two concepts that seem like they're not compatible, but they actually are the same. So the calories in, calories out, and the carb insulin hypothesis is really saying the same thing. And it's called a tautology, that yes, you can't lose weight unless you have less energy going in. I mean, we know this, but it's the absence of carbohydrates that allows the insulin to go down so much that your body's able to draw upon its own fat store. And that's why the hunger goes away. And we think it's probably the ketosis. We're not quite sure. No one has infused this to a level to scientifically to nail that it's ketosis that takes the hunger away. But the phenomenon is that the hunger goes away when you start burning your body fat, and it is the absence of carbohydrates that allows that fat burning to become maximal. And it is interesting. Yes, it also is low in calories. So both are true.
And those calories matter because you can be on a very low carbohydrate diet and still gain weight. And you can eat plenty of good carbohydrate sources and lose weight.
And again, these are not mutually exclusive ideas. There was one man that I'm aware of who did the study on himself of eating lots and lots of calories of different types of diets. It was something like 5,000 plus calories per day for 21 days of 3 different diets. One was high carb, one was low carb, one was moderate carb and vegetarian, and lots of fiber. And what he showed with his own measurements, this needs to be replicated. It would be one of the first studies I did if I had all the time and money in the world, is to show that different calorie levels of different types of calories leads to a different type of weight change. So he gained weight on a low carb diet, this is true, but he had to eat 5,000 calories a day in order to gain 3 pounds over that period of time. Compared to 5,000 calories a day of a high carb diet, he gained 11 pounds over that period of time. So the way the body handles the calories internally is very different. And sure, you can eat high carb, and if it's low calorie, you can draw upon your fat store. The practical implementation of that is hard for a lot of people. And so a lot of people try low calorie, high carb diets on their own or in other programs, and it doesn't work. They end up coming to my kind of program where it's low carb and the hunger goes away. You eat less automatically because you have that absence or very low amount of carbohydrate, and it creates a metabolic change we call euketonemia, or ketosis without the osis. That means abnormal condition of, well, I guess if you compare ketones of those who don't eat carbs to those who eat carbs, it is abnormal, meaning it's not what's typically seen if you're a carb eater. And so all of these things actually do make sense. You can have a low calorie diet, whether it has carbs or not, and you can lose weight or gain weight if it's high calorie but the way that calories are handled inside is very different.
Carbohydrates and insulin levels are so often labeled as the enemy when it comes to weight loss. And it stems from the fact that insulin actually prevents the process of lipolysis, which means cutting down or breaking down fat, while also increasing lipogenesis, which is the creation of new fat. And we know that when we eat carbohydrates, insulin is going to be released to deal and manage with the blood sugar increase. So the assumption is, since you're eating carbohydrates, insulin is going up. If you just avoided the carbohydrates, you wouldn't gain fat. But not so fast.
But that's true. Okay, what's not so fast?
But not so fast. The increase in insulin isn't made to make you gain weight or prevent you from losing weight. When insulin is present, your body doesn't stop burning fat altogether. It just does a lot less of it. It slows down the breakdown of fat for new energy.
Well, I don't know anyone coming to a weight loss program who wants less fat burning. I'm not sure if Dr. Morris says he has thousands of clients that have done well, which is great. And I think what we're hearing is a carbohydrate-centric view of metabolism, and lowering calories can work for a lot of people if you cut junk foods out, cut out the sweet tea here in the South. Well, tea is sweet tea in the South. So it may be that we have different clients that have different effects. And of course, you want to try out something yourself and see if it works. And if it's not working, I would address the carbohydrate in there, the calories, and the calories come second. If you do a very low calorie diet that you don't want to count calories, then do the low carb diet, because the calories will go down without you having to count them.
Which makes sense because you have a bunch more energy coming in. And this is what caused the insulin to be increased in the first place.
And I've heard that said a lot. Well, it's really not the carbs, it's just the energy. Well, carbohydrates are energy. It's almost as if there are people who are trying to argue out of the way our bodies work. There is this thing called gravity, but it doesn't always have to occur. If we're in a zero grav container or up in the airplane, we can actually beat gravity. I mean, I'm just trying to teach people how the body works and how to work within that. There are ways to lose weight and eating carbohydrates at the same time. And what's fascinating is that it depends on the person, depends on the metabolism.
Energy is going to be energy no matter where it's coming from. Let's think about this like money for a second. If you have $200 in your bank account and you have $20 worth of cash in your wallet, which would you use to buy something that's worth $10, for example? You would use the $20 in your wallet because it's immediately accessible. It's right there for you to use. It would take way more effort to go to the bank and take out $10 to use for the purchase. And even if you did choose to go to the bank to take out the money, you would still have $210 overall to use for that purchase, regardless of where you got the money from.
So that was great to hear, because I'd never heard it said that way. So the metaphor here is that the sugar is like the money in your wallet, easily accessible, and if you had a small amount, but if the bank is the fat, the vault of fat energy, and you have to draw and only big energy. This is totally a mischaracterization of what's going on in the body. Fat is actually going around, and it's typically not measured. Fat is going around on albumin. Fat is being stored in the cells themselves, and is actually a quick source of energy when your cells need it. So the idea that fat has to be locked up when you get access to that fat store, the lipolysis, when the insulin is low and the ketones are high, you're actually getting a circulation of fat from the fat cells into the cells, and you have it there as reserve. And there's a lot more energy actually in the form of fat in the blood than there is for glucose. Now, this, I think, again, comes from the glucocentric and the muscle-centric view of the body. The people in charge of gyms and fitness and exercise physiologists really focus on the muscle. And that's where the insulin is required to get the glucose in. And I've often thought that maybe insulin is there to keep glucose out so that fatty acids can get in and give the energy, the big source of energy that the muscles, especially heart muscles, really like. So you have to remember, insulin as a gatekeeper, like any door, can keep the energy out or it can keep the energy in. Using that only as a unidirectional sort of thing, insulin only allows glucose getting in the cell, and that's its only purpose. Really kind of, again, it distorts the entire picture, where you have fat going around in the blood, going into the cells, independent of this glucose and insulin story. And we measure things in the blood, and then we can characterize the health consequences of it. And diabetes, being an elevated glucose in the blood, is a problem because of carbohydrate consumption and because of insulin going up and insulin resistance. And it all gets fixed with this explanation if you cut carbohydrates out of the diet. I don't know why it needs to be more complicated.
Your ability to lose weight is certainly not dependent on insulin levels, and you're not required to eliminate carbohydrates from your diet in order to lose weight. And carbohydrates aren't the only macronutrient to be mindful of. Let's talk about protein. Even if you did cut out all the carbohydrates from your diet, your body would still secrete insulin. And that's because carbohydrates aren't the only thing that stimulate insulin in your body. It's a little known fact that eating protein stimulates insulin just like carbohydrates do.
Oh, hang on, not to the same extent. So it's interesting to see. Again, it's like, it doesn't fall as fast. I mean, protein raises the insulin level just a little bit, and insulin helps facilitate amino acids into the cells. So it has a totally different function, independent of the glucose function, that, again, some doctors who have opined about it, really think hard about it, think that insulin really isn't designed to lower the blood glucose. It's being used for that because of so much carbohydrate being consumed. I think it's an interesting hypothesis. So protein raises the insulin, but not much, nowhere near the amount that carbohydrate raises the insulin.
And eating low carbohydrate will keep your blood glucose levels lower, but whether you eat more carbohydrates or more protein, insulin is still going to be present. But if insulin was the main reason behind losing weight, wouldn't it make sense to cut out protein from our diets as well? It would make sense, but you definitely do not want to do that. Getting enough protein is a key piece in everyone's diet, especially if you're trying to lose weight and body fat.
I totally agree. So even on a keto diet, protein comes first.
Protein is very important when trying to lose body fat mass because it allows you to spare the muscle mass that you already do have. It burns the protein going in instead of the protein that you already have. And it's more satiating, so it'll allow you to feel fuller faster, which will mean you'll end up eating less calories overall. And relating to insulin, studies have shown that eating more protein and having an increased amount of insulin actually makes people less hungry. They feel more satiated and therefore eat less food. So insulin can actually help you suppress your appetite and be more successful when it comes to weight loss.
Yeah, and that's a carbohydrate-centric explanation, meaning when you don't eat carbohydrates, often you wake up in the morning and you're not even hungry. And I teach people it's okay not to have breakfast. Yeah, even though you've been told it's the most important meal of the day by the cereal industry. So yeah, you don't have to have breakfast, and when you're not hungry, you shouldn't eat. I mean, this makes no sense unless you're on insulin. That can make the blood glucose go too low, and in that case, they're saving lives by having people eat carbs with diabetes. But I tell people to cut the insulin down or away, and then they don't eat carbs. But so the idea, again, is that there are a lot of ways to go about this. When you don't eat the carbs, everything changes. Even the paradigm view, the expectations that carbs and then insulin and then, yes, you can lose weight on a low-calorie diet. In fact, the low-carb diet becomes a low-calorie diet. So we're all really saying the same thing.
Now, the elephant in the room here when it comes to insulin resistance, and weight loss is going to be calories. When it comes to weight loss, you definitely don't have to worry about keeping your insulin levels really low or even the fact that you're insulin resistant. What's going to be most important here is keeping a close eye on your overall calorie intake, because that's what's going to do most of the heavy lifting. In order to lose body fat and lose weight, you need to be ingesting less calories than you're burning so that your body taps into your fat stores for energy. And that's what's going to make up the difference. From this difference, there's no real right way or wrong way to make up the energy when it comes to macronutrients. Yes, you need enough protein, but how you distribute the calories coming from carbohydrate and coming from fat usually comes down to personal preference, exercise levels, starting habits. It's really based on the individual. And based on what we've discussed earlier, you don't need to feel like the only way to lose weight is to go on a really restrictive, low carbohydrate diet. It doesn't work like that. It may work for some people, but at the end of the day, it's not because of the carbohydrates.
So it's fascinating. Actually, the low carb diet does work for everyone. Not that everyone has to do it. So again, it's an interesting perspective of, don't take away my carbs almost. That, you can eat carbs and lose weight, no question. Not everyone can though. And those of us who have a predilection towards storing the fat really well, because of the carbs and insulin, have a harder time losing weight than others. And I have to think that we're just teaching different people. He may be telling someone to go out in the sun who can tolerate the sun, and I'm teaching people to avoid all sun because genetically they have a different predilection towards sunburn. And so but the reality is a low carb diet does work for everyone, not that everyone has to do it. And that's because the insulin levels come down, the body fat starts to burn. And the thwarting it, is possible if you're on medication, if you're totally sedentary and habit eating. Again, the calories, the amount you eat does matter. I want to end on a story that Gary Taubes first taught to my great surprise, and that was, as Dr. Morris is saying, yes, it is all about the calories, and this is true. And so Gary says, imagine that you're looking at a restaurant, and your friend says, why is the restaurant crowded? And you say, because more people went in than came out. And your friend goes, come on, it hits you on the shoulder and says, that's stupid. I mean, but why is the restaurant crowded? And I say, because more people went in than came out. And so this goes on, a while, and you become, the friend becomes annoyed because you're fixating on what everyone knows is true, is that the restaurant is crowded because more people went in than came out. So we all know that people gain weight by more energy going in than coming out. It's called a tautology. It's true, 100% true. So So Gary tells the story, meaning it's kind of silly because everyone knows more people went in the restaurant. So, is it good food? Is it great service? Is it, a great view from the restaurant? I mean, why is that restaurant crowded? And after I heard this, I couldn't go to my meetings, my obesity meetings, and listen to the calories in, calories out people anymore because they turned off their intellectual curiosity as to why more people went in the restaurant than came out, why more calories went in than came out. And they oversimplified things, and they ignored the low carb data, which basically said that, yes, you don't have to count calories, and yet the calories going in is less than the calories coming out. People actually lost weight. For many years, people denied that was possible. Now there's so much science that you'd have to have lived under a rock to not at least acknowledge that a low carb diet is at the table, and it's just a different method. I mean, so if you want to count calories, like he's talking about, do it. I mean, most people don't want to do that. Most people who come to my office want a simple method. The low carb method allows you to have less energy going in than going out, and in a comfortable way, and you get to eat great foods. So anyway, I heard Gary talk about this restaurant being crowded, and the metaphor of calories in, calories out was just brilliant. And it made it so I couldn't really listen to the same lecturers that I could try to listen to before. Now, David Ludwig at Harvard wrote a paper bringing together the calories in, calories out, and insulin, carbohydrate insulin hypothesis crowds, people who are promoting these as the most important method. And instead of making fun of the calories in, calories out people, as of course that's true, it can't happen without it, right? He uses the term tautology. Tautology meaning it's true, and it has no derogatory kind of connotation to it. In fact, I had to go back and look up what a tautology was, but that's classic David Ludwig to write it in a way that's very diplomatic, bringing the groups together and acknowledging that both ways are appropriate to think about and to use. And so, yes, calories matter, and you eat fewer calories on a low carb diet, generally speaking, not everyone. Just like on a low fat diet, if you're eating carbs, not everyone has the ability to limit their calories. They're fraught with hunger. At the crux of this insulin resistance, and I think this video was done to sort of say a low carb diet isn't necessarily better if you have insulin resistance or not. We don't really have great data on that. There are one or two small studies. And what I'm sensing now is that in the calories in, calories out world, you're dealing with people who can moderate calories, and they're active, they want to use apps and things like that and count things. In my world, where people generally don't want to do all that, or they did it before, it didn't work many different times, they want a system, a practical system where you don't have to count as much, you just follow a list of foods and it cuts your hunger out and you lose weight without counting calories, without putting your information into an app. The method I use goes back 150 years. The first low-carb diet book was in the 1860s. So very interesting. I learned a lot about the kind of mistaken notions of the carbohydrate-centric world, glucocentric, if you will. And I think this doctor's on helping people, which is great. And maybe he can even do a little better if he allows for the incorporation of lower carb diets for those who are not getting success on the other types of programs that he's using. I hope that's helpful. If you like, please like, subscribe, ring the notification bell. I'm putting out new videos on every Wednesday and Friday. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And check out AdaptYourLifeAcademy.com.